Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to our 7th In Dialogue event here at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. For those of you joining us for the first time today, either here in person or also via live stream, In Dialogue is a series of events where our institute's researchers engage in discussions about cutting-edge research and new ideas with invited and renowned scholars in the field of migration, social, and cultural diversity. Today, we are excited to mark the launch of the edited volume titled Aspiring in Later Life, Movements Across Time, Space, and Generations, edited by MPI-MMG, who is sitting across from me, Dora Sampaio, who is sitting next to me, and myself. The book is published by Rutgers University Press and available through open access. Now, while we take this book as a starting point, our discussion today goes beyond aging and aspirations. We also delve into the inequalities, but also the creativity that surround these themes in various social and cultural contexts. Thus, the title today also suggests the question: how might we reframe or rethink aging in diversity research? We have a great panel with us today to discuss these themes, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to them. Our first panelist and co-editor of the book, MPI-MMG, leads the Aging in a Time of Mobility research group based at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. Her research focuses on migrant labor, care, aging, inequalities, belonging, and citizenship in Southeast Asia. She is author of the monograph Caring for Strangers, Filipino Medical Workers in Asia, and is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Global Networks. Daniel Miller, joining us on the screen, is professor of anthropology at University College London with research interests in aging, digital anthropology and social media, material culture, and consumption. He recently directed the European Research Council funded project, The Anthropology of Smartphones and Smart Aging, or ASA. The project comprised 11 researchers who conducted simultaneous 16-month ethnographies across 9 countries. He has published and edited an impressive 41 books, the most recent entitled The Global Smartphone Beyond Youth Technology and Aging with Smartphones in Ireland, When Life Becomes Craft. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Isa Kabedija here in Göttingen today. Isa is Assistant Professor of Medical Anthropology at the University of Cambridge, specializing in Japan. Her research interests span health and well-being, aging and the life course, and art and creativity. She is author of the monograph Making Meaningful Lives, Tales from an Aging Japan, and the Process of Well-being, Conviviality, Care, and Creativity. And last but not least, I'm pleased to welcome back one of our Institute's alumna, Dora Sampaio. Dora is Assistant Professor in the Department of Human Geography and Spatial Planning, Utrecht University, and she's an affiliated researcher with the Max Planck Research Group, Aging in a Time of Mobility. Her research interests focus on migration, transnational families, care, intergenerational inequalities, and the life course. She is the author of Migration, Diversity, and Inequality in Later Life, Aging at a Crossroads, and also one of the co-editor of the edited volume that we are introducing today. So welcome, everyone. And my name is Victoria Sakti, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Aging in a Time of Mobility Research Group, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So just a quick note about the format. We will start with a short introduction from Mega about the book, followed by a discussion with the panelists. In the last half hour, we invite questions from both our live audience and also our online audience. So for those of you watching the live stream, you can also put your questions in the chat. So with that, I would now like to invite Mega to give us some opening remarks about the book and its key interventions.
Okay, Great, thank you, Victoria. Thanks also to fellow panelists and to our Institute colleagues and colleagues from across Göttingen for joining us and on the live stream too. I'm going to start with a little story about the book's cover image. This was an image that Dora took on one of her fieldwork trips to the Azores. And we liked it for this book because we thought the stacked stones were sort of representative of the building of aspirations across the life course. And we also thought the waterfall was sort of representative of the fluidity of these aspirations. Now, when the publisher sent us the first copy of the design, they sent it to us upside down. So you can imagine the image upside down, the text the right way up. And of course, this was very striking to us. And we thought actually it was quite a brilliant idea. And the idea they had behind it was that we are trying to flip the narrative about aging and later life through this book. We're trying to flip the narrative away from aging as only a time of passivity, immobility, stasis, and decay, and really to present it as a time of life where there are many possibilities for building life projects, for new kinds of mobilities and new desires. So that was really the goal of having the flipped image. In the end, we stuck with the image the right way up because we felt that it needed too much of an explanation, like the one that I'm giving you now. But I tell you this story simply to highlight the core goal of our volume, which was really to change the way we are talking about aging in diversity research and also in sort of broader public debate. And so with that, I'll move on to tell you a little bit more detail about the three arguments, the three kinds of interventions that we were hoping to make with this volume. The first being that some of us are coming from a migration studies background, and we were observing that a lot of the discussion on migration and aspirations was largely focused on youth, younger populations, working age adults, implicitly or explicitly. Perhaps the idea that younger people have more of a future to aspire towards. And what we wanted to do was really bring in a life course perspective to look at how these aspirations might change over the course of time. And also, just to consider the extended and non-linear direction of these aspirations. In a sense, it's not just that people start from going from A, achieving an aspiration and ending there, but these are constantly being reinvented over time. And so what are the kinds of aspirations that people might have specifically in later life? And then the second intervention we wanted to make was to challenge some of the stereotypes around aging in public discourse, but even in some of the scholarship on aging, where the dominant focus has been on older people as care recipients, as immobile, as I mentioned earlier. And we wanted to try and really present the diversity of experiences that can unfold and occur in this very broad spectrum of time. So we define later life in quite a fluid way, without sort of clear boundaries, taking into consideration some of the institutional definitions of later life, which might have to do with retirement age in some parts of the world, for instance, but also some of the social definitions that have come out from our ethnographic work on what constitutes later life, but also how people anticipate it and anticipate the transitions between certain phases of life. And so this was, and in doing so, we wanted to highlight the agency of older adults through this focus on aspirations. And then the third main point that we were trying to weave throughout this volume was a focus on inequalities. And because a lot of us are working with migrants and refugees or with people living in conditions of precarity, we thought it was important that we make sure that is very present in the volume so that we don't romanticize aspirations in later life. It's always in dialogue and in tension with the social, political, historical, and cultural context within which people are moving or within which people are aging. And so we have three sections in the book. The first part is on desires and self-realization. The second part is on intergenerational negotiations, and the third is on living in the present. So the third section really was trying to challenge the idea that aspirations are only future-oriented, and to look at some of the complex temporalities around aspiring, where people might have aspirations also for the present day. And just a brief note to acknowledge our contributors, some of whom might be watching on the live stream. They've all really brought an incredible ethnographic richness to these discussions, so really concrete cases that you can read about in many different parts of the world. And I'm also really glad that we can talk about this and also other themes relating to aging with Isa and Danny, who are not in the book, but whose thinking and whose work on aging has been very important to the way that we think about it too. So I think I will leave my introduction there and pass it back on to Victoria.
All right, thank you so much, Mega. So just to get the first question started, well, also because I have a little bit of insider information about the book. The book draws from Ajun Appadurai's concept of aspirations as involving wants, preferences, and choices, and that these are influenced by cultural practices and social contexts. And while the aspirations for a good life, for health, and also happiness exists in all societies. What the book tries to do is also to argue that these come in distinct cultural meanings, or these come with distinct cultural meanings, and especially in context of mobility. So now I'm interested whether this perspective aligns or not also with your work. How do aspirations manifest concretely in your research? And maybe, Isa, we could start with you with this point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And allow me to just thank the organizers for making this possible. It's a real pleasure to be here today speaking about aspiring in later life in celebration of this new book, but also in dialogue with what we've been working on. And as Victoria said, what's at the core of this book is the idea that older people have aspirations about a good life. And a good life is a topic very close to my heart. I have been working with older Japanese since 2008. And my fieldwork, as some of you perhaps know, has been based in the city of Osaka. And my field site was a small community cafe in a merchant downtown Osaka neighborhood, which was a community space that anyone could enter, run by volunteers, and stay as long as they wanted. Made for a perfect place to spend a lot of time with people, engaging in conversations, listening in on conversations in my capacity as a volunteer, but also nudging and steering them in subtle ways. And these were places in which we could kind of get a sense of what people are interested in and what constitutes a good life for them. So one of the things that resonates closely with my work here in this book is the sense that older people, if they're often presented as perhaps a social problem, a burden on the system, frail, are also at the same time providers of care and carers themselves. There are those who are involved in communities in various ways. Now, older people are very much agents of social change, and this was something that emerged quite strongly in my work. We tend to think of younger people as those who initiate social change, those that kind of move the things forward. But in this particular group of elders in southern Osaka, I found that the social expectation to move in, perhaps with the oldest son of the family, to live with them and to be cared for, perhaps by the son's daughter, and therefore live in a three-generational household, was partly, while still, a strong expectation in the Japanese society, was partly on the wane. And the media sometimes tends to interpret that as, perhaps the fault of younger people who either are not interested in that or no longer have the capacity to do so due to various demographic changes. But I've also found that many of the older people in these communities were actively cultivating networks of support and interdependence in order to avoid having to depend on their kinship networks and families alone and feel like they're being a burden on them. And in this process, they became the very important agents of a large social change. So I think that resonates very much with this idea of aspiring in later life and kind of challenging the idea of older people as passive. Another thing that I really took away as very interesting here is the idea of aspiring rather than just aspirations. And this links to my interest in well-being, where I tend to understand well-being not as an attainment, not as a state that one has, but rather an interpersonal process. So I define well-being as the intersubjective process of living and feeling well, which crucially does not pertain to an individual alone, but plays out within relationships and relations of care that constitute people. And I found very interesting resonances in this book that we're celebrating here today.
Thank you, Isa. Danny, I wonder whether you can also share a few comments about this question.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, first, I just want to express my appreciation for, I think it's a really excellent volume. I mean, it is such an important transformation in our usual perspectives upon aging, and there were just so many rich and inspiring examples. So really, thank you for that. I want to make 2 points. I think if you take one of the papers in the book that's about a Tibetan exile, it shows that we can't assume necessarily that when we talk about aspiration, we're moving to this kind of more individualistic kind of orientation and desire. And we can actually acknowledge kind of older traditions and particularly maybe older styles of anthropology. So in our project, for example, if we look at the aspirations amongst the Palestinian population we were working with, I think these did remain largely about living a good life as a Muslim. In agricultural societies, traditionally aspirations were about patrimony, the land you could keep for children. And for example, in Charlotte Hawkins' work in Kampala in Uganda, you can see how this translates into the real obsession with getting a good education for one's children. I mean, an absolutely fascinating example is in the new book that's just come out from Xinyuan Wang about China. And what she shows is that people are actually practicing their aspirations through the smartphone revolution, through the new capacities. But to understand it, actually, it all comes from values that were inculcated during the Cultural Revolution during their youth. And you can see how you can't understand the smartphone revolution and those aspirations without understanding the Cultural Revolution beforehand. Okay, so my second point's completely different. Because for other groups, the context for aspirations is essentially retirement from a salaried job. And I think this situation is revolutionary. It's without historical precedent. We have people who are likely to be 30 years in retirement, and that's probably as long as their entire working life. And during that period, they're not working. They are no longer involved in bringing up a family. And in my field site, they're not badly off either. And that is a kind of radical kind of freedom, I think, that we can explore. I think it'll teach us things really about what it is to be human and those much wider anthropological ambitions. But even on the basis of the work we've already done, you can also see that actually it leads people in very different directions, which come out of a global comparative project. So to take 2 extremes, the work in Sao Paulo in Brazil, a place very much associated with work. People have spent their life developing their status and identity around work. And in retirement, that's very much something they aspire to continue with and to make sure it's not lost. And that it dictates a lot of the choices they make as to what they're going to do in retirement. So by contrast, if we go to Ireland, where I'm doing my field work, actually, you wouldn't even know what work these people had done. I mean, the point about retirement is, okay, we're no longer doing those things. Think of all the things in the world we could now do. And actually, I would say that what's happened there is you're seeing how people in retirement aspirations can be seen as almost a kind of craftsmanship in which the thing they are trying to craft is their own life and bring together all those kind of possibilities. And I think those are the sort of two dimensions that I hope would kind of complement some of the things that were in your book.
Thanks. I think I would prefer now to move on to the next question, if possible. And also, it takes up a little bit from where Danny left off there with the retirement aspirations. In the book, some of the contributors also write that retirement aspirations include mobility, actually, the ability to move around, to travel, and to discover oneself new, also through being mobile. And as migration scholars, of course, when we think of mobility, we also think of immobility. And I'm wondering now whether Dora and Mega, you could say a few words about how mobilities and immobilities shape the aspirations of older migrants you worked with in your projects, and how they pursue these aspirations, and also the challenges that come with mobilities and immobilities and how they navigate that. Dora, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, and I think I will start also to say that it's so nice to be back, and it's also so nice to come back to the book and have this opportunity to discuss it together. Perhaps here, the perspective I will bring from my work with transnational families in Brazil, and then following the adult children who had emigrated to the United States, I think is this generational perspective. So how aspirations are indeed molded over generations. And perhaps it's even broader than that. Collectively, aspirations, world aspirations are wrought over generations. But in this particular case, it was very much around immobilities and mobilities and immobilities. So many of these migrants being undocumented for a long period of time meant that in many ways they found themselves immobile or still for a long time. And those were projects that were related, in a sense, with immobility related to an aspiration of building a better future, of having a path towards staying, gaining citizenship, and so on. But those aspirations, sometimes they were competing, and sometimes they were also they were convergent in the long term, but they were also competing at times, or divergent with that of their parents in Brazil that would like to be together, and physical proximity was so important. But at the same time, it was important to support their adult children in that process as well. So I think when I look back on how aspirations kind of took shape in this transnational space and through mobilities and immobilities, I really see how at the same time they were convergent, but at the same time they were also diverging in different directions. And then there was even, this being a sandwich generation in the US, there was also their own children in the US and their own aspirations as well. So it really was so many different aspirations over time. And here, clearly, there was also the institutional aspect, and borders played such a role on how aspirations are not just personal, but they are so linked to institutions and those that constrain mobility, for example.
Thank you. Yes, I think that also reminds of how the language of aspiration does imply this personal or individual process, but actually it's very much a collective project that involves generations and also institutions and regimes such as borders. Mega, in your research with older labor migrants with temporary visa projects, can you?
Yeah, I think this picks up quite nicely from Dora's last point on the role of borders and migration regimes and the way that they shape or constrain particular kinds of aspirations for migrants. And of course, you can think of retirement and the possibility of mobility and moving to different places with a sense of freedom when maybe you have the right passport, or when you are moving within sort of a mobility regime that enables that. But I think in the cases that we are looking at, it becomes a bit more complicated. So I work with older migrant domestic workers in Singapore who have been on temporary contracts for decades, so 20 to 30 years, 2-year contracts, constantly renewing them. Their families are in their countries of origin, they live in their employers' homes, but still they stay for a very long time. But because of their temporary status, because of their work not being valued, they don't have the right to permanent residence or citizenship. So at retirement age, they are required, it's mandatory for them to return to their countries of origin. So there you have the first limitation, which is people don't have the ability to choose where they want to age, even if they feel at home in multiple places across their migrant lives. But there are still many possibilities, I think, that mobility opens up for a lot of the women that I worked with. And it's interesting to see how aspirations change over the course of time. So many of them would reflect on their younger selves and think about how when they first went abroad, their aspirations were really oriented towards their families, educating their children, building a family house, sending money home for health reasons or family emergencies. And then at a certain point, they have achieved all of those things. And it's not that they say at that point, well, I'm ready to go back. They want to stay abroad longer. And that's when there's a bit of a shift to a more inward orientation, a more sort of orientation towards the self, of aspirations for self-transformation, whether this is through faith or religion, but also a fascinating new thing that has been emerging recently, which is migrant women taking financial education courses and adopting a lot of this language of sort of self-improvement, self-responsibility for the future. And of course, that's a double edge. It's their precarity, which puts them in this position of having to find these kinds of things for their future when they return. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of discourse, at least, or narratives about empowerment in doing these things. And so it's trying to find that balance between possibility and constraint when we talk about mobility and aspirations, I think.
Yeah, I think, mobility and immobility and the way we are trying to discuss it now in relation to aspirations speak also to your findings, Danny, in your ASA project, where you theorize the smartphone as the transportable home. So what would you have to say about how then that maybe could bridge some of the issues that we're talking about here?
I mean, I think firstly, it's a practical response to what you've just been discussing, in the sense that if you don't have choices in terms of where you can actually live, people are resorting more and more to what seems to be, if you like, it's a kind of plan B, which is essentially, can one retain the links that you care about? And the links you care about above all are the links with the people you love, the people you're closest to, the things that are really important to you. And is it possible to use new internet capacities to actually allow a resolution of the problem? Because even when people were more mobile, you end up with, the people, half of them in the diaspora in one place, half of them are kind of in the homeland, other siblings have migrated to Norway, Latin America, etc., etc. So effectively, this is the place where you can actually still be together. But that solution, in as far as it works with regard to mobility, actually pertains in some sense to all of us. And one of the points we were making is that people talk about smartphones, but it's not a phone. I mean, hardly anybody uses it to make phone calls. Actually, our argument is that in many other ways, this is essentially now a place within which we live. This is essentially, it's our main address, but also it's the place from which, we might do our shopping, see our entertainment, do our research, portal to our friends, etc., etc. So in a way, understanding what the thing itself is, actually, I think can start from actually understanding it as a place in which we live for all of us. And actually that takes us a lot further than ever thinking about this thing as a phone.
Yeah. If anyone has like an immediate comment, please feel free to also just give me a sign. Well, we could also think about it another way that, or Actually, Mega mentioned earlier that in this book, we also are very aware that we are not romanticizing aspirations, because although it is a capacity that is available to all, this capacity is not evenly distributed. And inequalities play a huge role, actually, in the pursuit of aspirations, whether people have the choices to do so or also the resources to do so. How do inequalities manifest in your work? Maybe, Dora, you have a new book that came out about inequalities in later life. Would you like to start?
I can try to summarize. It's a big question, right? Inequalities in later life. Referring to my book perhaps here and looking at different groups of older migrants and how different possibilities over the life course. So kind of really looking, and I think Mega in the beginning spoke about that very clearly. So what we experience when we work with older adults is not only the person we are speaking with at that point, but is a whole set of events that happened in our lives that lead us to that specific moment or moments in which we are talking. And I think my fieldwork in the Azores really showed, looking at people that had, so people had moved to the Azores to work and were aging in place. Azorians who had returned to this archipelago in the North Atlantic, and also people who had moved there just for amenities, just for climate, for a quieter peace of mind, quite a slower lifestyle. It was very interesting to see how those different life courses, those different life trajectories, enmeshed in a place and produced such different life experiences as well, contained in one relatively small place. So in that sense, those deep-seated inequalities, they were really pressing and really evident later in life. And perhaps here I can give some examples to make it a bit more concrete as well. But just thinking about where priorities also lied. And here I think it was already discussed, for example, the value of work. And I could see how certain groups, especially aging in place, older migrants, sometimes aging in place out of choice and sometimes because it was not possible to return to their countries of origin or other places. Just was so interesting to see how work and continuing to work. And I saw that also in the project in Brazil, just how much work is embodied and how much it becomes a source of self-worth, and people continue to work over the life course. And sometimes it's also a necessity. So those are really the inequalities that I see, that I saw, while some aging migrants were continuing to work, others had more time for leisure and for activities that occupy, so different usages also of time, and perhaps a different focus once more in aspirations, what I aspire as me, the individual, what I want to achieve in my life. This is a time of choice, and for others was not really a time of choice. There was not much to choose. So perhaps those were the very significant constraints that I could observe.
Yeah, I think I could also add to that. In my own research with older refugees in Indonesia, I think the language of aspirations does become a privilege that one would have to postpone later in life because of their circumstances. The older people I worked with had to work also until late in their 70s and 80s. And by work, I mean physical labor. And for them, it was not the matter of that they can choose to retire anytime soon. They actually aspire to be taken care of. So there's this sense that dependency, which is assumed that people don't want to be dependent upon on family members. Actually, the people I worked with aspire to be dependent on their family members because that means that they could stop working and finally enjoying their later life. And for them, that is only later on when they are approaching the final days of life. So Mega, maybe you'd like to add on to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm coming back then to the inequalities point, and actually also the dependency point. And I think with the inequalities, I'm thinking a lot about the gendered inequalities with the migrant women that I work with, and the fact that they have been working in care work for a very long time, and this care work is not valued. They do not have employment contracts with social protections or social security. It's essentially seen as, it's work that's not valued, which is why they are on very restrictive work visas. And very often the transition when they return home, it's a kind of transition from paid, low-paid care work to unpaid care work, where they might then be expected to take on grandmothering roles for their grandchildren when they return. And so this is quite different. There are a lot of expectations on migrant women, I think, in terms of what aspirations they ought to have. And I think sometimes this is at odds with some of their own ideals and preferences. And I think there is an expectation that they will work and then depend on their kin when they return. But what I found was quite a strong resistance to that idea of dependence on kin. Partly perhaps because of a fear of depending on kin after many years of not living together and not knowing how those kinship relationships would reestablish themselves in later life when they return home. But I think also a sense of wanting to do something for themselves and to not be dependent after having lived quite independent lives abroad. But it's very different, I think, for migrant workers on these kinds of contracts. And at the same time in Asia, you have wealthier diasporas who are returning to purchase retirement lifestyles, to buy retirement apartments in places in quite a privatized way. And so I think this is where I see the inequalities quite striking in the different kinds of migrants and diasporic returnees coming back to Asia.
And Isa?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to come in briefly because it occurred to me that perhaps retirement and work are words that come a lot into this conversation. And it seems to me that perhaps precisely work in older age and retirement are a place where we can see part of these aspirational possibilities and aspirational impossibilities taking place. So I started looking at work in post-retirement, I called it initially, among older Japanese, and it only occurred to me halfway through that project that I started in 2019 that some people do not retire. And some people cannot retire and are not entitled to a retirement scheme. And they simply perhaps own their own business and continue work. For them, aspirations are quite different than for those whose very ample and generous retirement scheme is in place. Now, when I started looking at working with people who are working in older age, various motivations came up, and many Japanese people report the wish to keep working into older age. But what is unclear from that statistical data is whether they wish to return to work because they like the sociality of it. And certainly on one end of the spectrum, we have people who wish to return to work because they found that quite a socially and emotionally and spiritually rewarding experience. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people who would like to return to work because they do need the resources. And for them, aspirations are quite different. In Japanese context, we have this interesting term, silver nobility, which are those people who are so affluent in retirement they can afford finally to do these things that they've been wishing to do all their life, go for international travel. But also increasingly I attended fairs for silver resources, by which they mean silver human resources fairs. Jobs available in these fairs are not the same kind of jobs that white-collar workers have held before. So very often a white-collar worker, upon retirement, finding themselves in an insufficiently pecunious situation, needing to go into a janitorial role or chopping vegetables for a large supermarket. So I feel there's a lot more work for me to do there, but I think perhaps thinking a little bit about what Danny mentioned in the very beginning, retirement and the possibilities that it affords, and curtailments that it sometimes brings with it, is one way forward to think a bit more about the capacity that's not available to all.
Yeah, well, I think the things that we have been discussing so far is probably going to answer the next question. Since aging has already become such a central research agenda because of demographic shifts, the main themes that are often researched are about care and kinship. And these are also the themes that interest us as well. And the questions also are there in contrast with changing family structures and also migration. But should research about aging only be about care and kinship? So what might we find if we look beyond these categories? Maybe, Danny, we can start with you.
Okay. I'm going to start with a quick fieldwork story, I think, which comes from a book I'm launching next month called The Good Enough Life. So naturally, when you do these studies, when I was in Ireland, I was saying to people, well, okay, so what really do you want to do with kind of the rest of your life? And I was astonished because almost everybody took this to be a question about where they wanted to go on holiday. So they said, oh, well, I've been to Brazil, but I'd quite like to go to Machu Picchu in Peru. Or if they were low income, I've been to France, but I'd quite like to go to kind of Eastern Europe. Now, I hadn't asked them anything about holidays. So I was thinking, like, what the hell's going on here? And it took a long time, but gradually I realized there were analogies with this in the way people talked about all sorts of things, the way they talked about the impact of feminism, the way they talked about the possibilities of the smartphone. And you could see that actually what underlay all of these things was what I think we can call a cosmology. What is it that they understand life to be about that forms those aspirations? And it was what I call an expansionist cosmology. The domains they can now occupy, which they previously kind of couldn't, and also the way they might expand with the possibilities of the internet, etc. And in the book, I use this because I think that in the traditions of Western philosophy, coming all the way back from like the Stoics and Epicurus, there's been an assumption that as you get older, you retreat to this life of contemplation. And that's absolutely not what was being expressed here. But I think the point I'm trying to make in relation to your question is precisely that if instead of zooming into these specific topics, be it care, be it kinship, actually, if we were doing our work in, I don't know, Amazonia or New Guinea, it would have been old school anthropology that we would have tried to work out, is there some fundamental cosmology, habitus, whatever you want to call it, that actually structures not just aspiration, but everything that kind of leads into it. When it comes to, say, Germany and England, we kind of have lost something of that tradition. But what came out of this work was the feeling that if we are prepared to go from the zooming down to the sort of wide angle lens, actually, it may well be that there is a much wider cosmological agenda in which we can contextualize specific topics like aspiration. And I mean, I find that something, it arose in the Irish situation. I don't know how often it's possible in other places, but I found as an anthropologist, it was actually extremely rewarding and interesting.
Maybe, Mega, do you have some findings from your own work that are not related to care and kinship?
Yeah, I suppose I approached this topic in a way from care. Care was a topic that I worked a lot on even before coming into studies of aging. And so I think it is kind of a natural lens sometimes to think about aging and care together. And I think I want to just say, of course, it's extremely important when we're talking about diverse societies and later life and older age that we are thinking about older age care and the kinds of possibilities that exist or might not exist for people, whether it's institutional care, whether it's state-provided, private arrangements of care, those are still important. So I just put that as a caveat before saying, before continuing what I want to say. But I think that if we kind of assume that older people are only in need of care, then it's a very reductive perspective, or we kind of then narrow our lenses on what other possibilities are in terms of when we talk about aging. And I think this was also part of what we wanted to do in this book. And so we have some chapters which are on care and kinship, because I think they always come in somehow. But I think there's also a lot more. So one of the chapters by Dumitricia Lunca is about love, and not necessarily love within a context of family, but it's about desire and sexuality and love in later life. Some of the research that I've been doing with migrant women emphasizes the role of friendship and sort of peer communities, and we don't talk that much about friendship, apart from Isa, who probably could say a bit more about this, the kind of peer community dynamics and socialities among older people in later life, and then other kinds of things that I mentioned earlier, like financial aspirations, aspirations in religious spaces. A lot of the women I worked with were very involved in volunteering and service and giving, almost in a sense of saying, well, I want to use this phase of my life then to be a good person, and some of that, with ideas about an afterlife and a good rebirth for those, maybe some of the migrant women from Sri Lanka that I worked with. So I think there's all kinds of possibilities we can keep ourselves open to if we just let go of our grip a little bit on the care question and on the kinship question.
Yeah. So going beyond care and beyond kinship, I think, Isa, your book also deals with these specific issues of how older people find support elsewhere, and they create these support groups or support networks. Maybe you can say a few words from your research?
Yes, thank you. Well, several things that were really interesting in this in this work that you present here is the capacious way that you understand aging. So I think what you've just described with the different sorts of interests and different kinds of aspirations that people have in different described in different chapters, including love and including friendship. It really starts kind of begging our attention towards the life course perspective. So can we somehow get a better insight into these existential questions of what makes people tick, and at the same time not lose the angle on it that is kind of an intersectional quality. A lot of the people that are featured in these chapters, in terms of, if we speak about inequalities, they are aging, but many are women. Many are in difficult economic situations. So we have this layering, the intersectional kind of layering of the inequalities here. So it seems as we kind of move through this book, we get a very, very broad variety of the types of inequalities. And to return to your question. That doesn't necessarily mean that people who are moving through life towards older age are no longer interested in aspiring towards anything. But what again struck me as particularly interesting in this book is it doesn't necessarily force us to say, in the vein of successful aging paradigm, that older people necessarily need to be aspiring if they do not want to. And a bit like the title of Danny's new book, what does it mean to have a good enough life? It's perhaps interesting that for many of the older people that feature in this book, there are lots of aspirations there, but sometimes people do not wish necessarily to aspire for more. So that kind of brings me to the question of how are aspirations evaluated? They're clearly linked to many values, some of which pertain to care, some of which pertain to kinship and giving back to family, some of which, in contrast, pertain to scripts that are more individualist and are about self-realization. At the same time, aspirations themselves are differently evaluated. Not everyone strives to have an aspiration, and perhaps it's impossible to avoid it, because even a devout Buddhist who tries not to aspire to anything is in that process perhaps still aspiring. But it's an invitation. I think the way that you frame this work, it's an invitation to start thinking about how we can evaluate aspirations in different cultural contexts for people of different ages.
Yeah, very interesting. Just to call on one of the contributions of the book, Julia Pauli wrote a beautiful chapter also about how some aspirations may come in the form of, we want things the way they are, just a little longer. Can't we just keep it a little longer this way? So aspirations can really come in different forms. Dora?
I think I would just perhaps dovetail on what Isa was saying. In my research, I think work came very strongly. That was definitely besides care, and I actually departed with the lens of thinking about care. And then what came back at me was, no, actually, we want to keep working. We are not dependent. We don't want to be dependent on our adult children, on other generations, and a desire to keep active, working and gaining resources. And one of the things that links back to this idea that aspirations are really shaped across space as well is that I realized, so some of the older parents that I was speaking with, they were going to visit for the impossibility that some of the children would come to Brazil to visit. They would try to get a visa and go visit their children abroad. And in that process, they would engage in work, temporary, informal forms of work, of making some money. And I think I was really taken by how much that meant, and that sense of purpose and that sense of meaning in later life was so strong, of managing with your own resources. And then when I started thinking deeper and deeper about this, I think part of it also came with a certain busy ethic that had robbed from their adult children abroad, and that idea that you have to work a lot, you have to gain resources, you need to get on with your life and get more resources. So I think it's also over generations, but also these, I guess, nuances, cultural nuances about how work is taken and what it means.
Thank you. Work also has like this concrete manifestation. But when we talk about aspirations, imaginaries, these are things that are often not yet present, that are often not yet here in the here and now, and it's more like in the space of possibility. So futurity and hope plays a central role in this. And then we also would have to ask, what is the life that older people hope for in their remaining years, especially when they are closer to the final years of their life? And Isa, you have worked really on these issues. Perhaps you can share some of your insights?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a fascinating topic, and I've been really struggling to make sense of the textures of perhaps hope. If we think of hope as this forward orientation, much like aspirations are, what does that mean for those among us who think of themselves as approaching the end of their lives? How is that future then envisaged? And does hope still have this predominantly future-oriented quality? And as I was wondering about how to approach this, I was listening again through the tapes of the live stories that I have recorded with some of my interlocutors over prolonged periods of time. And often after we finished our conversation, there would be a pause, quite a long pause, and people would stop and say, "I'm grateful for what had happened to me, and I'm grateful for the challenges that were brought to me." And in this space, in this pause of gratitude, I think we could see some kind of hope. So what we could sense there was a feeling that I have received so much from others, and if so many good things happened in life to me through being in my life with others, and others have helped me in one way or another, then something will happen, something good will happen. Things will be somehow nantonaku, as my interlocutor said. So in that way, I feel that gratitude creates this new understanding of hope at the very end of life for my interlocutors, whereby it's not just kind of dwelling in the past, but it creates a particular space in the current moment that through which, being grateful for all positive things and challenges that happened to us in the past, we can attune ourselves to the future in a different manner.
Thank you. Danny, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to add one more point, which is about whether you're given license to aspire. In 2017, I did a book called The Comfort of People, and it was a study of hospice patients. So that means these are people who've had a terminal diagnosis. Almost certainly they are dying. And I was so impressed by what the hospice movement then does, because we do have these kind of metaphors. You invest in the children, would you invest in somebody, as it were, who is going to die? And when they come into the hospice director basically says, this is a stage of life. This may be the time to get married, to have an art exhibition, to do something you've always wanted to do and never done. And you could see how the actual institution was transforming people's understanding of what that period of dying actually meant. And people associate me with studying the effect of technology. There's no technology involved there. It's simply changing people's perception of what a period of life can actually mean. And the hospice movement in the UK is brilliant at actually doing this. So it's just a sort of minor point, but I think it is about, sometimes you get license to aspire and sometimes you don't.
Thank you. Maybe Mega, you have some comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sometimes one of the questions that we might get, and or not even the questions that we get, but the questions you hear in public debate, and especially during the pandemic, this was very, very visible in a lot of public debate about the kinds of sacrifices that younger generations were having to make for older people, decisions in hospitals about whose lives to save during the pandemic, and then this other kind of discourse on we need to protect older people, everybody stay at home, limit your contacts. And so I think in some of the discourses which were saying we need to get back to normal and essentially older people are disposable, dispensable, I think that was quite clear in a lot of the narratives and some of the political debates as well. And I think what Isa has said and what Danny has said is that just because somebody is at the end of life, it doesn't mean that there isn't still a way to make meaning in that time of life. And I think it also goes back to this idea that aspirations are never individual, they're always social, and that people are always situated in this social field with family, with peers, in institutions. And so I think we can always think about aspirations in a more expansive way and not only in this very individualistic kind of this person is at the end of their life. And I think that's a different way to reframe that discussion of how much time is left and what is there to aspire for.
We have 2 minutes left for the panel discussion. So Dora, you have the last 2 minutes.
So perhaps here, I think would you like me to go in any direction in this final 2 minutes? Just kind of continue on these discussions. I think perhaps here I will dovetail on what Danny said earlier, perhaps about social media and usage of digital technologies. Maybe that also links a bit to the work that I did and also work in the book, and just the role of really technologies in this communication, especially when mobilities are not possible, and perhaps we see that all in our research as well. The role that technologies play when physical proximity is not possible, and also during COVID was such an important means as well. And that is also something interesting to see, digital literacy, courses, and seeing how older people, again, kind of flipping this lens of passivity, of non-engagement, but the other way around. A lot of engagement, a lot of usage of new technologies, to be in touch with kin, being in touch with other people as well. So I think I will leave it there, and perhaps there's still time for others to chime in as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, there's a lot of insights that we can further build on with our audience here at the Max Planck Institute, as well as our online audience. If you have any questions, please do raise your hands. And for those watching the live stream, please type your questions in the chat. My colleague Nicolas will read them out for you. So yes, please, whoever has a question, you are very much welcome to take the stage. Maybe Karen, yeah, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm Karen Schönwelder from the Institute here. Maybe for the online people, we should explain that I think you have to register with YouTube, yeah, to be able to enter a question in the chat. Just if you're trying to do that and don't know how. I wanted to ask you a bit more about this migration aging angle, yeah, because a lot of what we've been hearing about was about the changing meaning of, well, later years in life now. But for the migrant specific, I was wondering what you do with failed aspirations, right? Because I mean, migration itself as a project is connected with specific aspirations, right? It's often, I mean, people usually say they want to return home at some point in later age, and then they find they're not doing it for particular reasons. Migrants typically have very high aspirations for their children's future. Yeah, it's typical that they expect them to be lawyers, doctors, whatsoever, and not all these aspirations come true. They may have experienced frustrations in their jobs because typically they have to, well, stay below their qualifications in the labor market. And we may be idealizing things specifically with migrants. We talk about this 30 years of healthy, yeah, die jungen Alten, yeah, the young aging, because often immigrants will be the people who have done the menial, yeah, manual jobs, and these people typically don't reach retirement age but have to retire early for health reasons. And their aspirations may be restricted for some job-related ill health. Yeah, so I mean, how do people cope with the, on the one hand, failed aspirations? Do they stay positive typically, or what types of people do you encounter in your research?
Perhaps, yeah, I could start with that. I think that's, yeah, really an interesting point, because I think a lot of the migrants that I worked with did have, you know, if you want to call it them, failed aspirations. So they had the aspiration to put their children through education, through university. Sometimes their children would not finish university, or their children would graduate from university, have a job, but it would still make sense to migrate abroad as a domestic worker, like their mother, because you earn more. And so there is a cycle of precarity that continues. And I think that, and other migration scholars have written this, sometimes people also return to sort of set up a business, the businesses fail, and they go abroad again. So I think we can't talk about aspirations without also talking about the flip side, the failed aspirations and the precarity that is consistently in migrants' lives. But I think what a life course perspective allows us to do is to see how those aspirations then get reconstructed and they take on a new direction, they take on a different kind of purpose. And I think it's perhaps a way for people to keep going with things and to say, okay, I'm not quite satisfied with how things have gone. And we do have many stories in the book where there is a conflict in aspirations. Sometimes the migrant wants something for their kin, they want something different. So it's important to say as well that yes, there is friction, yes, there is failure, so to speak, but there is also, again, this new chance to aspire again afresh for other things. And that was something that, yeah, in a sense, we were also talking about different scales of aspiration. That's perhaps another point that I wanted to make, that not all aspirations end up being grand ones, and this relates to what Isa and Vicky said earlier about when referencing Julia Pauli's chapter. If she was here, she could tell it with more detail, but that people sometimes aspire to keep things as they are because sometimes the future brings unknowns and more risks, and there is then a comfort in aspiring to extend the present.
Yeah, I think with failed aspirations, we also have to think about how individual or actually how shared these aspirations are. Then we do have to look at whose aspirations are we talking about. Are these specific to the one older migrant who has these aspirations, or also their family members? But with the people that I work with who are living in resettlement and refugee camps since over 20 years. Older members, they wish to go home. So they do have these dreams to one day return to Timor-Leste, but it's impossible for their family members because there are many things that they would have to think about. What if one day the grandmother or grandfather passes away while they are not with them, and the burial place will be away from where they are? They wouldn't be able to carry out rituals that they will still need to do for over generations. So a lot of people who I spoke with would express their aspiration to return, but then at the same time, they also balance their desire with what makes sense for the family. But it doesn't mean that it's a failed aspiration. It doesn't mean that they stop desiring this return. They keep on to the hope that maybe one day, when the family is able to return, they could carry the burial plot back home. And so the hope does continue. And yeah, I guess, would you like to add with any of your findings, perhaps?
I would say something, just reflecting on failed aspirations. I think that's a very important point. And thinking about, are they failed, or do we just shift as a tech? We just go in different directions and aspire to different things. And I think, as we were discussing before, the time is so important because we don't aspire to the same things all the time. And I'm just thinking, looking back at the relationship between aging parents and their adult children, sometimes even aspirations, they can be themselves bifocal in a sense. So you want your children to do well and have and gain residency rights, but you also want to have them with you. And they don't necessarily, those aspirations, they don't match at points. And there's a level of hope, and there's also a level of acceptance, accepting that that aspiration at that time is not going to work, and then changing it to a different direction. So maybe I aspire that they do well, and how long it takes that they need to be abroad, then that is what is best. So I think there's also a level of altruism in giving it to the other person as well, in terms of aspiration. So that's my take on it.
Just very briefly, I think it seems to me that what comes clearly from these answers is that aspirations are never just your own. So it's never just one individual. I think that's really a very important takeaway point. And so then failure also isn't so simply ascribed, because maybe not everyone involved in the aspiration evaluates what has happened in the same way. But it also seems to me that aspirations themselves can be quite cruel, like Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism. So what the description that you gave of, a migrant who has very high expectation of their children's success, that very idea of success is very culturally, historically, socioeconomically specific. And it's a very specific idea of what matters in life. And so those can be in tension. And I think it comes across really beautifully in Cathy Coe's chapter, where she talks about scripts. And the kind of scripts for the good life that are competing, and scripts that people quite effectively merge into one another as well.
Danny?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow from what Isa was saying, and sort of the cultural conditions that can limit aspirations or make them fail. I mean, I think the best example in my work was when I was working in an a very English context outside of London. And what really, the tragic condition that confronted older people was loneliness. And the extent of loneliness, it was hard to exaggerate, including funerals that virtually nobody came to. And I just was trying to understand this. And this wasn't mobility. This could be people who'd lived in a village their whole life and seemed to know nobody at the end. And in the end, I argue that actually a lot of this had to do with very specific English cultural traditions. That actually why issues of social embarrassment, issues of why when you haven't talked to kin for 20 years, you're not able to actually repair that. And particularly in working class life, the tradition of not going into people's homes. The notion of privacy that meant that when you were no longer mobile, you were no longer visited and things emptied out. So I sometimes, culture itself can be tragic. In other words, it actually can have forces which mean that for many, many people, one of the main aspirations of later life, which is simply to have a social life, fail. And I mean, I was very shocked by it, but I mean, the job then was to try and understand it. And it's not to do with, absolutely what he said. It's not about individuals. It's about cultural values and conditions that mean that so often people end up in loneliness.
Thank you. I think we have one question again from the audience for Jamila. Yeah, because otherwise we can't hear you. I mean, Danny can't hear you, and also the online audience can't hear you.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. This is just a contribution to what you've just discussed, and it reminds me of a fieldwork that I did in London among African migrants who had the aspiration, first generations who had the aspiration to return home for retirement. And I remember there was this elderly man who came from Ghana, and he's been in England for ages, for over 50 years, and he always had his bag packed to one day go home, but he was never able to go home. There was also another one, a lady, who said that she went back to Ghana, but realized that everybody that she knew had died. Her mom had died, her dad had died, her other brothers and sisters were in the diaspora, and she had nothing to go home to. And also all of her children are in the UK, grandchildren are in the UK. So eventually the aspiration to go home had actually died. And that home has become the UK, not because she really likes the UK, but it's just that there's nothing to go home to. So sometimes conditions change and people decide to change their aspirations, not because they want to, but because things have actually changed to the point that they have to stay put where they are. So I think it was quite interesting to see that some of your fieldwork reflected that, because first generation migrants always have the aspiration of going back home to retire, but not always, the case, especially within the African context, either in the UK or in other European countries. So it's interesting to see the linkages. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you for the great talk. I don't know if this is maybe the rightest question that I can ask you, but I was wondering, because I saw some of the articles are quite related to females specifically. I wanted to ask you, what is your take on the loss, I'm gonna frame it like this, but I hope it's gonna work. How do you look at the loss of social status, which is related to the aging, which is related to the female position in society? Because this is something that I've like tiptoed a little bit like in the past week or so. I would be very interested like if you have any experience in that specifically. I hope I hope I made it clear.
The loss of status.
Social status, which is related to like, I'm gonna give an example maybe that would work better. I have in my mind something that we were discussing with colleagues, like for example, the loss of social status of ballerinas as soon as they stop being young and being able to, do their profession, because this is what made them who they are actually. So they lose both their job that they aspire to actually do a long time, and then they lose their social status and so on in relation to aging.
Anybody like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think a little bit about, in the case of the migrant women that I work with, they have a status not because of being women, they have a status because of their migrants. And so they are the breadwinners in the family as women because there were opportunities for them to migrate in a kind of feminized sector of labor, which was domestic work. And so I think a lot of the loss of that status when they stop working, it's really about when they stop working abroad and they return home. That is where there is a loss of status, and that is also somehow coinciding with the time of life when they are aging. And in a way, then they continue to do a lot of the same kind of work, as I was saying earlier, that they still do the caring work that they did abroad, but suddenly that status of being a carer is very different if they are migrant or not migrant. Just a brief comment.
Any other responses?
Dora, did you want to go in?
I think I will make it very brief. The first question reminded me a lot of Doreen's Massey saying, you can never go back, because people change and the places change, and I cannot agree more. It's impossible to return in a way. And maybe when people also return, in fact, you return to something that has changed, you have changed, you might not be in tune anymore. And that reminded me exactly the experiences and the lives that I saw unfolding here, going back to the Azores, and really see how people, when they return, then there's also languages that are used to others. So it's about the place, it's about the person, but it's also about the others that you're surrounded by, and those relationships, and how languages of othering also develop that you feel part of or not. So that's perhaps my answer to the first question. And to the second one, I think I would just say that is definitely true, a loss of status. I saw it happening also in the other way, which is transnational mobility can enhance status, and I saw it again happening. So I think there's, especially in the global context we live, where there is indeed more people on the move, mobilities can play a role also in what has been written about, exactly the processes of maximizing resources and enhancing your own status in that sense.
I think it's
Any remarks from Lisa?
Sorry. I think it's a really interesting question about the kind of the intersection. I suppose the question has a lot to do with the standards of beauty. But it makes me wonder, whether a really sustained attention on life course perspective helps, in that part of that loss occurs with childbearing, but at the same time, a different kind of status develops. And so if I think now about my interlocutors in Osaka who are in their late 80s or their 90s, that loss seems like such ancient history to them. And at the same time, I think completely new sense of freedom is attained. So very, very often when I ask people how they're going, they're saying, it's so easy, my life is just so easy now. And that is because they were freed from many social obligations and social expectations to finally do things they wanted to do. So I think it's a little bit like with the failed aspiration question. There are things that come after, and the scripts are rewritten, and the story goes on.
Danny, do you have some remarks on that?
Actually, I suppose most of the cases I'm thinking of, it is a bit more the other way. And the reason being is that in many societies with traditional gender divisions, men have that association with work, that they kind of are the ones that kind of lose that kind of status in relation to retirement. They lose their status in the public domain often. Whereas, as one goes into retirement, more emphasis comes on things like social connectivity. And in that same family, it tended to be women that actually were skilled at that and had maintained family relations, maintained friendship relations. So in some ways, I found the balance tends to shift from things that had valorized male status more to shift to things that had valorized female status. And actually, these men suddenly back in the domestic realm were just not, I mean, one of the things we had is this thing called the men's shed, which is basically how do you deal with all these men who basically hadn't had that kind of role within the domestic. So that's probably more the pattern I've seen over time. And also, as he was saying, that I also found that women felt that actually there was a real freedom in this kind in aging, in the sense that they're not being valued in the same way. They're, you know, that actually they can enter into life in different ways. And I think they did experience that as a form of freedom, often, not for everybody, but often.
Thanks. So we have another question from the live audience.
Yeah, please. I have a question. What is the dynamics you observe in society's expectation to older people? So what are maybe tendencies or what changes, like more proactive, or in what way you expect or you observe those changes?
I feel like Isa, maybe you can say something about this, especially because you work in an aging population in Japan.
Yes, I think, well, one thing that is very noticeable, say 10 years ago, what abounded were the kinds of societal anxieties and really reflected in the media and the media narratives of anxieties about aging society. Now that really took place, anxiety is no longer as much of an issue, but certainly work and working longer, retirement ages, and the working population comes to the fore. So thinking about expectation, on one hand, there is a sense of obligation to be the good old person, therefore to look after one another, not to become a burden. A little bit, you know, if you think about Sarah Lem's successful aging models in the US, there's a certain similarity. At the same time, you know, there is also a feeling that people should perhaps work longer. And that is something they should be contributing to society in clear ways. So in that sense, I feel that the expectations are somewhat shifting in relation to the past. And I think also the demographic change really makes a big difference. If there's a very small number of older people, the kind of reverential kind of quality of the elders as these rare repositories of knowledge really does unfortunately seem to shift when the seeing older people everywhere becomes commonplace. At the same time, that has positive effects too. So if you wherever you go in Japan, you're going to see silver hair and in a way that creates an inclusive feel, and it creates a sense that, you know, well, maybe I can also be doing all kinds of things as I age. So maybe that opens up as well the kind of the sphere of aspirations.
Do we have any other immediate comments? Otherwise, we can move on with the next question.
I'm Hannah Carlson from Radboud University, a guest here at the moment. So for my PhD, I did a lot of fieldwork in daycare centers, and I wanted to know how migrants access care in the Netherlands, so I tried to get a super diverse sample. So I saw a lot of people from different cultural backgrounds in the Netherlands. And what struck me as I spent quite a lot of time with them just drinking coffee or chatting or being interpreted for and chatting was that it didn't seem to be just culture or migration history that determined if somebody still aspired, in the sense of having an open view to life or being curious still or wanting new things? Because some people had quite some challenges in their lives and they still had many aspirations, and others were more closed and seemed to be more waiting or just wanting things to stay as they are, or perhaps waiting for things to end. So I wonder, in this fascinating different types of contexts where you did research, were there certain factors across these contexts which enabled people to aspire, which made them continue to be curious about life or wanting things for themselves?
Thank you. Yeah, who would like to start? I think that's also like one of the, well, we're talking about concepts, and the concept of aging is, on the one hand, a universal phenomenon, right? But we're researching in different cultural contexts. So we have a few minutes left for the discussion. Please, whoever would like to start, maybe can just go ahead.
Maybe what I would like to say to that is that it's somehow, when we talk about comparison or comparing different cultural contexts, I mean, perhaps Danny can say more on that from his ASA project, but because in our research group, we've been working with aging migrants. And so, you know, it is often the case that we can't really speak of different cultural notions of aging because people have many different influences as migrants. They are both Filipino, they think of Singapore as their home, they have relatives in other parts of the world, and so I think somehow it's difficult to speak of a cultural, I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a cultural factor in the cases where I'm working necessarily, it's often migration related, I think, you know, embedded in Karen's first question earlier, that migration often has many aspirations embedded in the very act of going abroad somewhere. And so I think for me it is that sort of creation of a good life across multiple homes for themselves and for their kin, which is somehow the driving force in terms of shaping their aspirations.
Yeah. Like.
Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that the question really brings out is a certain kind of humanism, in the sense of just respect for individual difference. And inevitably, when we have this kind of conversation, we are generalizing around, you know, typicalities and can we relate this kind of factor to that kind of result. But it is also the case, and particularly when you're in a more cosmopolitan environment, the likes of Amsterdam, I imagine, certainly places like London, that actually there is that freedom of diversity, eccentricity, individual, that you will expect to find a much greater range of people's attitude to the place in life they are. So the sense in which they can see themselves now as elderly, but actually it's so much easier not to see yourself as elderly in a place like London these days. You can sort of fit yourself into a certain kind of category as a migrant, or you can say, actually, who cares where I'm from? It's London. So what I think you brought out, which is in a sense experiential, is the sense that actually when one's dealing in ethnography, we have these two planes. On the one hand, we do see things we can generalize about. We do try and theorize causation and correlation, etc., with other factors we're interested in. But actually, there's a limit to that we also simultaneously, when we write our stories in our ethnographies, we are trying to show respect for individuals and their specific differences in relation to that. And we meet many people who bear no relation at all to those kind of generalities that we're trying to make. And that is the humanism that we always want to retain in our ethnographic description. So I think, you know, it's a very valuable point in that sense.
Thank you. Maybe just some last remarks from Dora and then Isa.
I think I will just follow on the same comments. I think it's difficult to make it very particular to a culture. I think aspirations are really like they are entangled in so many influences, and that those are cultural influences, of course, but also the places we are in, time. So I think it's really complex to kind of pinpoint one specific one. But I will say that from my work, work has become indeed, the work in Brazil showed me how much work has become important in later life. Isa?
I really appreciate this question, and I think what is very important, I think what it makes me think about is very important analytical issue there, that we tend to think that aspirations are positive, that they are good, and that openness is a good thing. So at the same time, I would like to say that not all aspirations are good for everyone. Sometimes they can be problematic. Sometimes they can cause issues and challenges. And so that it seems to me that we kind of have to differentiate the evaluations of aspirations by different people from their content. And the second analytical point that I think this example really brought to the fore is that it's not the same whether one still has aspirations and whether one has still curiosity and openness to life. It is entirely possible that a person at the end of life might be willingly and happily eschewing aspiration and yet remains open and curious about new experiences.
Well, thank you. I think that's a really great way to also conclude our discussion for today. I would like to thank you very much, our panelists, for being here today, Danny for also being here online as well. I would like to thank our live audience as well as our online audience. And yeah, I wish you all a very good late afternoon still. And until the next In Dialogue event here. Okay.